Listeners, beware. This podcast contains themes of the macabre and does not shy away from the details. Our content is graphic and our language is colorful. We might not be your cup of tea, so listener discretion is strongly advised. Hosted by two best friends with a proclivity to decipher the deeply demented minds of murderers.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 16, Part 1, on Aileen WOURNOS, the Damsel of Death.
We are your hosts, Christina
and Chelsea,
and welcome to Part 1 of our season finale.
Oh, buddy.
I can't believe that we are now going into Season 3 at the end of these next couple episodes.
I know. This is amazing. If you have been listening to us from the beginning, thank you. We love y'all so much, and we are so excited to bring you another deep dive.
This time, we are going to talk about the one
and the only
Aileen WOURNOS. And we went back and forth on how to tell Aileen's story because there are so many layers here. Ultimately, I kind of think that we should start with her mother, Diane, and build from there because maybe you guys have seen the movies. There's a documentary and then, of course, the famous movie Monster with Charlize Theron. But even if you don't know Aileen's story, I can almost guarantee that you know her face.
Yes, her face is one of those that the second you see it, you know exactly who she is.
Yeah, it's just bizarre. So, okay. Our story first starts with Diane WOURNOS, the 14-year-old mother of Aileen WOURNOS. Diane was born in Troy, Michigan, to Larry Jacob WOURNOS and Aileen Britta Moilanen. Larry was born in Minnesota in 1911 and Britta in Michigan in 1917. Both Britta and Larry were children of immigrant parents from Finland who came to America in hopes of a better life, as was incredibly common in the early 1900s.
Definitely.
Britta was a kind woman who loved to paint and write poetry, while Larry was cold-hearted and a bit of a enthusiastic disciplinarian and also violent drunk. A little interesting tidbit about Larry's family. At the age of 59, his father would commit suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning.
Very interesting. The WOURNOSes were a bit of a closed-off bunch. They were not known for being very sociable with their neighbors, nor all that friendly. Neighbors would often describe their family home as one where the kids did not play outside and the curtains were always pulled closed. Diane was one of 3 children, with a younger sister named Lori and her older brother named Barry. While Lori and Barry would grow up saying their father was not an abuser and albeit a strict disciplinarian and maybe even sometimes harsh, they claimed to have had a quote-unquote normal childhood. However, Diane's behavior spoke to something much, much different. While she was considered by her teachers and those who knew her to be a well-behaved girl and a good student, Diane ran away from home frequently. We suspect that it was Larry's authoritarian parenting and hard physical discipline of his children that made Diane want to leave. But she did still keep her reasoning to herself. One time, she even went as far as to hide in a neighbor's attic for 2 days.
I find it interesting that Diane was running away, even though her brother and sister say that she wasn't in an abusive household, that their childhood was totally normal. We know that their dad is a drunk. We know that their mom is a secret drunk.
Mm-hmm.
what is going to make this 14-year-old child run and hide in an attic
for 2 days? We know now that Diane was physically abused by her alcoholic father, Larry, for several years. From her worldview, she felt that she grew up in a home where love and affection were scarce, where hugs didn't happen, and her mother sat idly by, too drunk and scared to help her. She never got along with her parents, and there was even some talk of inappropriate touching done to her by her father to, quote-unquote, make her mother jealous, which... that's
creepy.
Weird and gross at best.
I read a couple different excerpts from books and listened to a bunch of different podcasts. It was as if Diane herself came forward later on in interviews, much later on in life, and said, oh no, I wasn't sexually abused, but there may have been some inappropriate touching that happened. And one time she describes her father saying, come give me a kiss, and kisses her as a man would kiss an adult woman in front of their mother. And Diane was like totally disgusted by this and perplexed as to why her father would do that. Red flags are just abundant. You have this otherwise really good kid who's running away all the time, and then her dad is low-key kind of a creeper.
Yeah.
I think there's a little bit more going on now, and that's why I think she's so desperate to escape that when she meets the boy next door, a very handsome 17-year-old man named Leo Pittman, who was originally named Leo Dale Briggs, because as it turns out, Leo was also being raised by his maternal grandparents because his parents left him, just totally dropped him. And foreshadowing, but he is actually pretty much a troubled child who is an asshole. He is out robbing people, stealing things, performing Grand Theft Auto at the tender age of 17. Kind of a big deal. But regardless, Diane and him fall in love very quickly, and with his grandmother's blessing, she literally signs the wedding documents. They get eloped, and Diane's only 14.
It's crazy to me that at 14, Diane leaves and is married. Something about Leo and Diane's marriage. Leo was allegedly very possessive with Diane. He would control her life and often be drunk or in trouble with the law the entire time they're married. Only a year after they had been married, their first child, Keith, was born. And less than a year later, on February 29th, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, Aileen WOURNOS was born. Interestingly enough, Diane had filed for divorce 2 months prior to Eileen's birth. Now you may be wondering, dear listener, what would make a pregnant, almost 16-year-old file for divorce from her husband 2 months prior to the birth of their child?
Diane thought that she was going to escape her abusive father. She thought she's going to make a better life for herself, and she was going to have all the things that she had been missing out on. Well, it turns out, like you mentioned, he was not the tall, dark, and handsome that she had been hoping for. And he, just like her father, had a problem with alcoholism. And when he would drink, he was prone to bouts of these furious, jealous rage, and he would actually beat her. His temperament was entirely unpredictable. So, as you can imagine, Diane had enough. And despite the fact that she had an 11-month-old boy, she was ready to get out of there. But also, Mr. Pittman struggled with the law throughout his entire life. And while she knew about some of his other misgivings, as her children were being born, Leo kept getting in trouble with the authorities. And it escalates when just little baby Keith is not even a year old, and he ends up getting arrested for car theft. And then the judge says, well, you have 2 options: go to jail or enlist into the army. So Leo enlists into the army without even realizing that Diane is pregnant with Aileen. But while he's away, that's when Diane's like, all right, I can get out of this shit show, files for divorce. but many other fun things happen after that as well.
In 1962, Leo is arrested for the rape of a 7-year-old girl. In June of 1962, it's suspected that he raped 2 other 10-year-old little girls. He is diagnosed as schizophrenic during his trial and is sent to a state mental hospital, where he escapes, is caught, is deemed to still be insane, and is sent back, and eventually is found that he is able to stand trial, where he is found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. He was serving time in the Kansas City Penitentiary in Lansing, Kansas, when he hung himself on January 30th, 1969. Aileen and Keith would have no memories of their father.
Aileen never met him. He was actually convicted of 3 crimes: first-degree kidnapping, statutory rape, and sodomy of the 7-year-old girl. Not only that, but he had been investigated in a totally different case around the time that Keith was born of murdering a little girl, but there was a lack of evidence, so they couldn't proceed.
There was a lot of crimes that happened with Leo in a very short amount of time between the very late 1950s, we're talking like 1957, 58, through 1962 when he is finally caught in jail.
Yeah, he got picked up for breaking and entering, was sent to prison. He served like 3 years.
Grand Theft Auto.
Which that was the one he was on probation for. But during all this time, he had made claims that he would just pretend to be a schizophrenic in order to get away with the insanity plea.
And in case you have forgotten, because it's been over a year since we talked about schizophrenia last, the symptoms of schizophrenia often include delusions, hallucinations, symptoms that blur the line between what is real and what isn't, which makes it very difficult for the person to lead a typical life. Schizophrenia can be linked through genetics, but there's no guarantee that those who have those genes will be triggered and an individual will develop schizophrenia. So whether Leo was truly schizophrenic, I feel is kind of up for debate, as he was overheard telling his cellmates that he would pretend to be mentally ill, but he does commit suicide, which points to some form of mental illness, and we know that there is mental illness on Larry's side of the family. I think it's safe to say that Aileen is getting some of those genes from both sides of the family.
Going back to Diane, so she divorces him and she tries to stick it out on her own for about a year. She's got 2 very young children and she does okay for a little while, but ultimately she is a child herself. She's like, what, 16 years old, 17 years old?
17.
Ultimately, she goes back to the WOURNOS home in Troy, Michigan after this year of trying to make it on her own. Only when she gets there, she realizes nothing has changed. If anything, the dynamic between her and her parents has only worsened. And one day, she asks her friend Marge to babysit her 2 small little kids so that way she can go out to dinner. And then she just left.
Her best friend Marge, who was also just a teenager, waited a week before telling Diane's parents that she had skipped town. She had been holding out, hoping that her friend would turn back up and get her kids, but Lori and Britta would come to collect the children and take them in.
Let's remember, this is the same girl that holed up in a neighbor's attic for 2 days to get away from her father. One who literally married a man pretty much straight off the bat to get away from her father. And now she's just left her 2 children?
Yeah, something's not adding up for me there. Either Diane was just that troubled as a child for no reason and there really wasn't abuse in the house, or
she was so abused that she hit her breaking point and just could not function?
I'm not sure. Whatever is going on here, though, doesn't quite make the most sense to me.
I guess you could say, I mean, she is still a teenager. Maybe she just couldn't cut it as a single mom. Maybe it was too much. Who knows?
She really is only 18, maybe 19 at this point.
It's just incredible to me that Diane left her children to the mercy of the very household she had been so desperate to escape.
Very strange.
So after some time, Diane does resurface. For unknown reasons, when she fled, she had ended up in Texas. Now, there is hearsay that she went down for a job. Others say it was because she met a guy. Whatever, she got the hell out of Dodge. When she reestablished communication with her parents, she opted to give them custody of Keith and Aileen, and they adopted them. So they went from being Keith and Aileen Pittman to being Keith and Aileen WOURNOS.
She would occasionally send gifts and money for her children, but it is suspected that Larry and Britta would get rid of these gifts. And Keith and Aileen were led to believe that Larry and Britta were actually their parents, and that Diane's younger siblings were their older siblings, which would cause much confusion later on.
So by the age of 2, so Aileen is 2, and that means that Keith is 3. Mm-hmm. Now, you have small children that age. They know who mommy is.
Absolutely.
I can only imagine what it does to the brain of a toddler to go from this is mommy, the person that you're attached to and love, to suddenly, no, that's not mommy. This is mommy.
But we also don't know what kind of attachments Keith and Aileen had to Diane. So, I mean, we have secure attachments with our children, but does someone else have secure attachments with their children? And to be fair, if I died, would Maisie remember who I am?
Very true. Very true. Irregardless, Diane leaves again when Aileen is at the age of 2, and this time it's for good. So that object permanence that kids don't really have,
it's gone.
It's gone. Because we're talking a lot about this really kind of bizarre family situation, Chelsea and I did a little bit of research into behavioral health when it comes to disordered families. So I'm going to have Chelsea take over the research on this, but get ready because these are some numbers.
In July through December of 2012, there was a chart review of 154 patients at the Lincoln Prairie Behavioral Health Center. I won't go into too much depth on the research because it is a very, very small sample size. It's a lot of numbers that, we can just summarize here. But it was found that only 11% of those children came from intact families living with their biological parents, and that strong association was found between exposure to trauma and certain diagnoses in respect to hospitalization, and that ADHD was predicted a 4 times the likelihood of having more than one previous hospitalization with a mood disorder. And those other mood disorders could be oppositional defiant disorder and physical abuse, increasing the risk by more than twice. The conclusion with all of that is that there are significant differences in family structure, and that those were demonstrated in the study that they did on those 154 patients. The presence of trauma and family psychiatric history predicted higher rates of readmission of those children, and that the study highlighted the role of psychosocial factors, namely family structure and its adverse effects on the mental well-being of children.
So in layman's terms, your family and your family history does well and truly, at least in the small sample pool, show how greatly it can affect you. And we have Aileen.
Well, look at literally almost every serial killer we have covered. If they have this disruptive family type or a family member, who is in and out, ultimately what it boils down to is kids need stability. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter who they're getting that stability from in the end, but that stability has to be there.
An interesting thing from the family structure and trauma: depression at a young age, substance abuse, poverty, a history of mothers being separated from their own mothers during childhood, all served as risk factors. A lot of this stuff rings true, and we are just climbing into the story of Aileen as a young child, but it does ring true for her, especially some of the information here listed about surrogate fathers, because her grandfather is essentially being her surrogate father, even though she grows up believing that he is her biological father. She finds out at a relatively young age what the truth is. And it says that some 30% of these children were expected to be living with an unrelated surrogate father. Studies also found that the presence of a step-parent increases the risk of being abused by a staggering factor of 20 to 40 times, in contrast to living with single mothers. Now, obviously her grandfather is related to her, but he is in this surrogate father / stepfather role. So just some things to think on, I guess.
Yeah, and again, this is a very, very small sample size, but, still something to think about.
Okay, this is kind of introducing us into the life of young Aileen WOURNOS.
So where we are at, Aileen and Keith have been adopted. They are being raised as Larry and Britta's children. Britta is known by Aileen to be very loving and nurturing and just a warm figure. However, Britta is often very sickly because of her secret alcoholism. Larry, on the other hand, is behaving much the way towards Aileen as he did to Diane. Aileen claims to have been beat and sexually abused by Larry, and she even claimed that he was verbally abusive to both Aileen and Keith, would hit them with a belt and say that they should have never been born.
At the age of 9, while playing with her brother, they managed to light a small fire that kind of got out of control, and Aileen would suffer small burns to her face, and it did leave scarring, but she would go on to tell a taller tale about this story, about it being more horrific than it was. And I think this is like the first real notable inclination that she is craving attention. And she finds it in this big fish story about her little fire. Now, I don't want to discredit anything because she did have scarring. It was kind of a thing.
Well, her and Keith would often set small fires for fun. And this particular instance, the fire just got out of their control, essentially.
Oh, she was a fire starter?
A fire starter.
Interesting.
You don't say.
Very interesting.
Interesting.
At the age of 11, she was called, quote, incorrigible by her teachers, as well as being a hothead. So unlike her mother, who was considered to be a good student and a well-behaved kid despite running away, Aileen becomes kind of infamous for her temper.
I wonder where she got this from. Could it be her daddy?
Her IQ was tested, and it was around 106, which is, I'm 110. Perfectly average. But she did have other problems, like she had hearing issues, and she had vision issues. And it was even said that she was kind of like scruffy. Like she was a beautiful little girl, but she was unkempt and scruffy looking.
What I find is interesting is that she was tested, and they found she had vision and hearing issues. But Larry and Britta would write off those issues as saying that Aileen just wasn't trying hard enough.
Knowing more about Aileen as an adult, she is an intelligent person. And I'm kind of confused when she's noted to have an average IQ, but then they say that she has below average intelligence.
It was academically.
Yeah.
She didn't really apply herself. She was known to be a troublemaker. And who knows, maybe she didn't apply herself because she had vision and hearing issues. Because if you can't see what your teacher is writing on the chalkboard, obviously that's going to cause some problems for you later on. The school highly suggests that Aileen get counseling. They say this girl needs counseling. But guess what? She never gets it.
I cannot emphasize enough that Aileen is known for her explosive temper. Everyone who encounters her has that same story to tell, and this is why it's bringing such attention to the school, to the teachers, because clearly something is troubling this kid. And she does act out. She is, even at this young age, she's not even 11 yet, and she's seeking out unhealthy attention from classmates, from boys, even though she herself isn't quite socially adept. She's known for being really standoffish, and even though she wants friends, she doesn't really invest in them, and when she actually does make friends, she kind of pushes them away at a very young age. And this is a habit that she carries throughout her entire life. And her entire life, not just her adolescence. Some interesting things start developing with Aileen. First, she begins to sneak out of the house quite a bit, and she's hanging out with kids who are much, much older than her.
We're talking 17 and 18-year-olds, and she is only 11.
She would desperately seek out attention because, like I said, she wasn't great at forming those strong social bonds, but she still had this part of her that wanted to be the center of attention, that wanted to be a movie star, and everybody knew that she wanted to be a movie star.
Yeah, that was a very well-known ambition of hers.
She even was said to have actually been a really talented singer. I don't know if you heard that.
I heard that she was a talented singer and a talented artist.
No, I didn't hear about the artist
I
thing.
heard that she was really good with art as well, which is a shame that all those talents that she did have would go to waste the way they did.
Yeah, because what did they ever go to waste?
Soon after all of this starts happening, Aileen and Keith would learn that Britta and Larry weren't actually their parents, but their grandparents, and that the quote-unquote siblings that they thought they had were actually their aunt and uncle. This was a huge blow to both children and something that Aileen claims to have impacted her later on in life. At the very young age of 11, Aileen is sneaking out. She's going to these parties. She's seeking attention. She started going to this party area called the Pit. And she would begin trading sexual favors for cigarettes, drugs, and alcohol. And at the Pit, doing these sexual favors, she would earn herself the nickname of the Cigarette Pig.
Or Sig Pig.
There isn't a definitive person that is known for being her first sexual encounter, but according to witnesses, this would happen around the age of 11 or 12. And there are reports that Aileen and Keith even may have engaged in sexual intercourse with each other. But Larry and Britta's other children, Barry and Lori, would claim this to be untrue.
Barry and Lori live in a fantasy land compared to Keith and Aileen. They are older.
Barry moved out.
Yeah, he's gone.
When Aileen was 9. Mm-hmm. He wasn't around for this part of her life.
And he was in the military. He was the golden boy. He was gone. He was his dad's favorite. He doesn't know what's going on. And then Lori didn't even know her mom was an alcoholic. When things would happen later on, it completely took Lori by surprise because she didn't know. So frankly, I really don't take what she says
to be all that reliable.
Yeah, no. And we know from Keith and Aileen that they had sex, right? Who introduced Aileen and Keith to sex at 11? Interesting how Larry is kind of known for being a creeper with Eileen's mom, uses Diane to make his wife jealous, and now suddenly, mysteriously, his 11-year-old granddaughter knows how to have sex?
I know we talked heavily on sexual abuse and sexual dysfunction in younger children only a couple episodes ago, like very recently. So I don't want to hit heavy on that again. But I do want to talk just a smidge about it as kind of a recap on what is going on. In an article by Nancy D. Kellogg from the University of Texas Health Science Center at San Antonio in the American Academy of Family Physicians website. This is verbatim what it says. It's very short. Children who have been sexually abused at a younger age, who have been abused by a family member, or whose abuse involved penetration are at a greater risk of developing sexual behavior problems. Although age-appropriate behaviors are managed primarily through reassurance and education of the parent about appropriate behavior redirection, sexual behavior problems often require further assessment and may necessitate a referral to Child Protective Services for suspected abuse or neglect. Does this mean she was 100% sexually abused? No, but there are signs that definitely support that she had been.
In my personal life, there is somebody very close to me that had this happen, where they were sexually assaulted very, very young. And I will tell you that the description that goes on of Eileen's life runs almost parallel with this person that I know. And it only changes after the teenage years, when of course, Aileen goes totally off the rails. But it is very interesting to me, as somebody who has lived on the sidelines watching behaviors like this, and I can identify that they are literally parallel. And not only just that, I mean, the chances of an 11-year-old in the 1970s knowing how to have sex, let alone the brother participating, like, to me, that says that both of those children very likely had endured some sort of sexual abuse. And then for her to have such disassociation with her body to use it for cigarettes for the other teenage kids at 11, to me, that's like, wouldn't you think it would take years of going through some sort of abuse to disassociate that much?
I would think so.
I don't know. This is all speculation. It's not substantiated. She does make some claims, Aileen does, later on in life, but these are just our opinions. Throwing them out there. We're think tanking right now.
Barry and Lori would go on to say that Lori was a strict parent, but he never abused any of the children. There was no abuse in their home, and they are staunch on this. They would often say that Aileen was a problem child and had brought everything upon herself. However, Aileen and Keith would both say yes, they were hit with a belt on their bare butts.
And sometimes with the belt buckle, the metal buckle. One of those big ass buckles.
And Barry would later even go on to testify against Aileen in court. Now, there is something weird that is also going on in their neighborhood at this time. There was a couple who would often let the neighborhood kids come and hang out at their home. They were the Podlacks, and Aileen would like to go and hang out at this house. They would drink, do drugs, hang out. Aileen claims that she even had sex with Mr. Podlack, but again, it's just Eileen's words. However, Mrs. Podlack was an ex-burlesque dancer, and Aileen claimed to have enjoyed spending a lot of time with her. I think this is a very odd
setup scenario.
Yeah, almost like a grooming scenario.
It's worth mentioning that even though we said that Aileen kind of looked like a scruffy, unkept kid,
she was still an attractive girl.
She was beautiful. She was a very beautiful young girl. And she did know it, which is why oftentimes her looks were a means to an end for her. Mm-hmm. She was opportunistic, where she would use those things in order to get what she wanted. Even though she wasn't a materialistic person, she wanted to gather money and gather drinks and things like that in order to have parties and be a socialite.
She thought that by her being able to provide these services, by being able to make money to provide cigarettes and to provide alcohol and to provide essentially a party atmosphere, that in turn her peers would like her more.
And I think with the padlock situation, she got attention just for being young and interested.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So I do kind of agree with you potentially on the grooming aspect of that, especially because very shortly after, Aileen becomes pregnant. She's 14 years old. She has been having sex since she was 11. Boys would come to her all the time to lose their virginity. Her brother's friends were coming to her to lose their virginity. We know that her and her brother was having sex, but there's even allegations that her grandfather and potentially her grandfather's friend had raped her and could potentially be the father of her. They don't know who the father of her child is.
No.
She doesn't know who the father of her child is.
In March of 1971, she is actually sent to a home for unwed mothers during her pregnancy. She gives birth to her son, who she names Keith, and he was given up for adoption. Aileen would later talk about how upset she was about having to give up her son and that she wanted to spend time with him but was not allowed to. Shortly after his birth, she goes back to her grandparents' home, but she ends up not staying there for very long.
We mentioned before that Aileen would run away. And at the beginning of this episode, you can hear us walking through the woods. That's because Aileen grew up in the woods of Troy, Michigan, and that was her safe haven. That's where she would run away to. And when she was homeless, she would just camp in the woods. That was her home. Most of the time, that's where she lived when she was away from her grandparents' house. And the pit and all of that stuff was such a important part of her life. It's just crazy to me that she is so far away from people, both socially and mentally, but then goes back and forth wanting it, like wanting the attention. And she doesn't even realize that these boys that she's taking into the woods to service them think she's a laughingstock. They think she's disgusting. They would never date her. They're not interested in her.
Cigarette pig?
Yes.
What kind of nickname is that for someone?
They're not interested in dating Aileen. They're not going to the woods with her to form a relationship. They're going there to use her. And I think this entire time she is searching for something that she just cannot find.
Shortly after the birth of her son, when she goes back home, Britta dies of liver failure. Her autopsy revealed that she was intoxicated at the time of her death and was covered in bruises. Larry would go on to claim that he had not killed his wife, despite literally nobody accusing him of doing so. This is very suspicious to me. And this led people to actually begin wondering if he had in fact harmed his wife.
Because we get most of this information from Aileen. I think a lot of people, in particular her own siblings, think that this is like folklore and storytelling that she's weaving, because she is a storyteller.
She is.
However, there is so much witness testimony about her family life. Like, the neighbors were paying attention. The kids that used Aileen eventually came forward. It's not just Aileen's perspective that we're getting this information from, and other people heard him say this,
Which is very
fucking suspicious.
It is very fucking weird. Soon after that, Aileen drops out of high school at the age of 15. At this point, Larry kicks her out of the house for good, and she begins living on her own. At such a young age, and with nowhere to go, she starts living in the woods near the house and would use prostitution as a way to make money, so she can eat.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, Aileen's sister Lori offered to let Aileen live with her. Lori would claim to never feel safe with Aileen in the house. She refused to keep a job and would often steal from other members of the family or their family friends. Aileen even lived with her eldest brother, Barry, for a short time. But after threatening his wife that he would, quote unquote, kill her if she didn't shut up, that was it. That was it. She even goes as far as threatening Keith, which is the only family she has left at this point, with a knife. So her family pretty much just writes her off. They're done. They wanted to commit her to a mental institution, but were afraid of what she would do if they tried. And so they never attempted to get her the help that she clearly needs.
The only person that Aileen was ever truly close with was Keith. Even though they had a turbulent relationship, they're basically twins. They're Irish twins. They're 11 months apart. They look fucking identical.
Oh, yeah.
If you pull up the pictures of Keith and Aileen, I mean, they are doppelgangers of each other. And while they would go back and forth, he was her only person that she was able to maintain somewhat of a stable connection to, because even the few friend or two that she has, she does push them away. So as she goes through all this being a vagabond and prostitution and a streetwalker and all that stuff and living in the woods, Keith is still her best friend. And though they disconnect because now she's going out into the world and getting further and further away from her family, he's still the most important person to her.
Which is why in 1974, when Keith is diagnosed with throat cancer at the age of 20, this is devastating for her. This cancer would ultimately spread to his brain quickly. But what's interesting is that 5 years after the death of Britta, on March 12th of 1976, their grandfather, Larry, would end up killing himself in the garage of his son, Barry, who he was living with at the time. Neither Keith nor Aileen would go to his funeral. Instead, Aileen decides to start traveling the country, hitchhiking, and using sexual favors as payment.
It's because of this that Aileen really didn't know that her brother had gotten so sick. Her best friend was running food and stuff over to him and checking on him. But Aileen was off in her own little world. She had found a biker gang that she was interested in and was hanging out at biker bars. And for a while, she was making really good money.
In May of 1974, Aileen is arrested in Jefferson County, Colorado for a DUI, disorderly conduct, and firing a pistol from her moving car. She was released, but never showed up to court. She then hitchhiked her way down to Florida, where she met the literally most unlikely partner in the history of ever.
They say that they just struck up a conversation, but otherwise there was no reason for those two to ever meet or connect.
Louis Gratz-Fell was a 69-year-old yacht club president, and he fell for the 20-year-old Aileen's charms and married her quickly, even going as far as announcing their marriage in the society pages.
He doted on her.
Yes.
For the first time in her life, she had brand new clothes. She got to drive around in his Cadillac. He got her a big old diamond. And for a very short period of time, she got to see how the other half lives. However, the woman who was not materialistic and who had never had money in her entire life, she wasn't great with it.
No.
So she kind of went off the deep end when she started spending this poor gentleman's money.
He eventually reins her in and gives her basically an allowance, and she kind of flies off the rails and ends up ruining their relationship. She gets into several altercations at a local bar and then assaults Louis with his own cane. Louis files for a restraining order against her, and she went to jail briefly for her assault against him.
But she did claim that he attacked her too.
Yes.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. He filed for divorce, ending their marriage after only a few weeks.
I think that it lasted a month.
Yeah.
Oh, buddy, that is a whirlwind of things happening all at once. So after being released from prison, the newly divorced Aileen goes ahead and she travels back to Michigan. She begins getting into more altercations. She can't keep her mouth shut. She's very mouthy if she feels like anybody disrespects her, especially if they call her crazy. And she's drinking heavily. So yeah, of course, she ends up getting arrested yet again because she threw a cue ball at a bartender's head.
On July 17th of 1976, her brother Keith finally succumbs to cancer and passes away. Aileen ended up profiting from his death and received $10,000 in life insurance funds.
Which I'm sure, we didn't look it up, but $10,000 in 1976, I'm going to guess it's probably more like $30,000, $40,000 now.
Could be. I didn't look it up.
But that was a lot of money, especially for a girl who never had money.
No. She uses this money to pay off a legal fine from one of her many arrests and spent the next 2 months splurging on luxury items and buying a car that she ultimately ends up wrecking not long after she buys it and ends up going through the whole $10,000 in roughly 3 months. With her inheritance spent, she was once again completely broke and on her own.
Aileen doesn't have a mother, doesn't have a brother,
doesn't have a father,
has no stable connections, and suddenly she is all out on her lonesome.
And this is where we leave you.
Oh man, what a bundle of dicks that is. Like, say what you will about Aileen, and for those of you who don't know anything about her, you just wait. But that's a lot of trauma. I mean, if we summarize it, she was abandoned as a baby, more or less. Her dad's a convicted pedophile rapist, potentially murderer.
Potential schizophrenic.
Her great-grandfather committed suicide. Her
grandfather committed suicide.
Shit is just wild for her. And not only that, her lack of attachment and just kind of being all over the place with her emotions and the anger. I mean, we're talking about lifelong anger that's basically being described, like where she would fly off the hinges since she was a tiny little kid. Fire starter, didn't see anything about bedwetter. I know her dad was a bedwetter and into teenage years.
Nothing on animals.
No, nothing on animals.
So we're only really seeing one thing out of the McDonald's triangle. But there are a lot of things that we are seeing that are leading up to red flags.
Yes. At this point, it could kind of be like Aileen just doesn't do anything with her life. Just kind of becomes a barfly or something, right? Mm-hmm. There's nothing as of right now that tells me Aileen is going to become the first woman serial killer in a non-care capacity.
Yeah. Dun dun.
You can't see it, but we're both making these really weird faces because shit gets so fucking real. I'm doing the hand claps. I'm so sorry. All right. So let's just update you guys on everything. So this is going to be a 4-parter, kind of what we did last season unintentionally, but now we're going to close out the season with 4 episodes. Getting ready for season 3, have a lot of fun stuff in store. You guys can actually recommend serial killers to us. We haven't completely laid it out yet, so you guys got a couple days after this releases. Give us some input. Who do you desperately want to hear about? Who do you not know enough about that we need to know about? Tell us. Let us know.
And we are going to be doing these deep dives in every season. So who do you want to deep dive on next?
Yeah, who do you want your next 4-parter to be?
Please don't say Bundy or Dahmer.
We'll get to them eventually, but isn't enough Netflix documents?
I just mean I don't want to do a deep dive on Dahmer or Bundy.
Yeah, no,
It's been done.
It's been done.
It's been done.
Maybe way, way later. But for now, can't recommend watching Monster starring Charlize Theron enough. Incredible movie. More stuff on that later. There's been a bunch of so-so books. The current book that I just finished is Lethal Intent by Sue Russell. There is an audiobook for this one, which is a must-have for me. Highly recommend. It's been a ride. It has been a ride.
I feel like we kept falling down rabbit holes.
And you can actually access the WOURNOS family tree through Ancestry and some other sites.
Very interesting.
That was also very intriguing.
All right, y'all. Well, as usual, you can find us on all our social media platforms. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at The Killer T. You can also send us an email to thekillerT@gmail.com if you feel like it.
All right, y'all. Until next time.
Bye.
Join us in the next episode where we discuss Aileen WOURNOS, Part 2. The Damsel of Death. Weren't you the one that was just saying not to eat?
We're not doing food ASMR here, kid.
Oh, I'm totally gonna get heartburn from this, being fucking pregnant eating Doritos.
You hoe.
All the terrible noises.
Oh, God. It's the worst.
So, like, psychology me here on this ASMR shit. Are people, like, getting off to it, or they just like how it sounds?
I think some people find it calming for their anxiety.
How?
It gives
it causes me anxiety.
more anxiety.
That's crazy.
I don't know.